Hello, everyone. I'm Lauren Billignac-Kozal, the Associate Dean of the Honors College here, and it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Kara Alaimo, who is an Associate Professor at Fairleigh Dickinson University, and who has written, among other books and many, many articles, this extremely important and powerful work that has just come out in 2024, Over the Influence, Why Social Media is Toxic for Women and Girls, and How We Can Take It Back, which we will be in conversation about today. For many of us, we are actually welcoming Kara Alaimo back to campus as she spent many years at Hofstra University as a professor of public relations in the Department of Communications and also as a wonderful and remarkable faculty mentor in Honors College. Not to mention a dear friend and inspiration to so many of us, faculty, administration, and students alike. In addition to her brilliance, extraordinary research skills, and her many achievements, Kara Alaimo is completely delightful and down to earth, as those of you who have read the book already can attest to, and as I believe you will see for yourselves over the next hour and 25 minutes. So in every way, you are in for a treat, even if the subject matter gets very dark very quickly. Kara has been writing for CNN Opinion about the impact of social media and issues affecting women since 2016, as well as here in this book. I'm also happy to report that she offers us all sorts of practical solutions to these seemingly insurmountable problems. Before we begin the conversation, I will just mention two other accomplishments of our speaker for today. Dr. Alaimo was a former spokesperson in the Obama administration and a communicator at the United Nations, where she worked on the United Nations Task Force to End World Hunger. She is also the mother of two amazing young girls, which may have something to do with the passion with which she takes on the subject matter at hand. So I hope you will join me in welcoming Dr. Kara Alaimo over here. And once this screen goes up, I have another person to welcome, who you can see over on the side, who is my esteemed colleague, also from the School of Communications, Dr. Christina Wu, who will be in conversation with the two of us. So thank you so much for coming. I hope you all have your books in hand, and if you don't get to it, we'll certainly read it over this summer. Everybody should read it. Okay, thanks, Kara, and let's get started. Thank you. There we go.
Hello, everyone. Mic check. Good. Okay, I will have the privilege to ask the first couple of questions of Dr. Alaimo. Welcome, everybody. As somebody who's more familiar with your work, research on related subjects, and your public engagement on this very important subject, we're at a pivotal moment, nationally and globally speaking. And I guess we should start by taking a step back and asking you what motivated you to write.
Okay, that should be better. Let me know, please, if you can't hear me. So I was first motivated to write this book to try to figure out how I should handle the social media use of my own young daughters. And there's this saying that, we write the books we need to read. But after I finished the book, I went for a walk with my CNN Opinion editor, and we basically had a laugh about how naive I had been to think that my biggest problem was going to be handling my own daughter's use of social media, because I now realize that my biggest problem is that my daughters are going to live in the world that social networks have wrought. And so, this book follows the arc of the life of a woman from the teen years to online dating, to our careers, to how we parent our kids. And every chapter ends with a section called What We Can Do About It. But the thing that wasn't in my book proposal that I realized after interviewing women and girls across the country and finishing my research for this book was that I think that what's happening on social media is making the offline world more dangerous for women and girls in many ways. And so it used to be the case, say 8 or 10 years ago, that sure, there was lots of misogyny on social networks, but it was often segregated to darker corners of the web. And I think what we've seen happen in more recent years is that this kind of misogyny has gone mainstream. And so now it is a common part of youth culture on TikTok, as many of you may know, to quote unquote joke about violently abusing women. And that's really unique compared to other forms of extremism in the sense that American teenagers are generally not on TikTok joking about, say, beheading people. And one thing that I know as a professor of communication is that a large literature tells us that witnessing acts of violence in media is associated with committing acts of violence. And so I think that a lot of this misogyny that people are seeing online is normalizing the idea of treating women and girls quite terribly. And if you look at the shocking increases in domestic violence in this country since 2015, just as social networks are taking off, or if you look at CDC data, so the CDC put out its Youth Risk Behavior Survey last year, which found a huge increase in the percentage of teen girls who said that they had been forced to have sex between the years 2011 and 2021. So many indicators tell us that in many ways the world is becoming more dangerous for women and girls, and I very much tie that back, at least in part, to the normalization of this violence that's happening on mainstream social networks.
So, Kara, your first chapter is aptly titled Girl Meets Instagram. We got this, okay. And it looks at how social media affects teen girls. Can you tell us about that and the advice you'd offer to parents in handling their young daughters?
So one story that I tell in this chapter is of a woman who asked me to call her Vivian. And she wrote to me after reading one of my CNN opinion columns and said, I got my eating disorder on Instagram. And what happened is she was 15 years old when Instagram launched. She was an early adopter, and she was really into yoga. So she posted a picture of herself doing a handstand. That picture was picked up by a so-called Fitspo, or fitness inspiration page, and she was very quickly sucked down this rabbit hole of very toxic content. But I also acknowledge in this chapter that social media is also a place where girls who are minorities in their physical communities go online and find really important support systems. It's a place where kids develop interests that turn into careers or get involved in important causes. And so much of it comes down to how we use social networks. And I offer loads of advice for parents in this chapter that I think is really relevant for all of us. One big piece of advice is learning not to judge people based on their appearances. And I think that this takes on increased importance on visually oriented apps like Instagram. So we know that the so-called Instagram body can usually only be achieved with surgery. But getting back to Vivian, she's now in her 20s, working as a physical trainer, a personal trainer. She tells me that her clients regularly pull out their phones, pull out Instagram, show her pictures of the Instagram body and say, I want to look like that. And so one piece of advice I have, it's actually not written in this chapter, but comes from Kate Mann's book. If you're not familiar, I think she's one of the most important feminists alive, and her book Unshrinking was published in January. And she talked about how she would take out Instagram and show her young daughter pictures of people's bodies, people of all different ages and races and levels of ability. And what she would say to her daughter is, "I'm so glad they are here in the world with us." And I thought that was just such a beautiful way of teaching a child, or really someone of any age, not to judge people for their appearances. And then, I talk about how parents need to teach their kids, and we all need to be aware of some of the huge dangers that kids, but really people of all ages, face online. So a big one is sextortion. So that's where someone will establish an emotional relationship with you online, convince you to send one racy image, and then the next text that comes through is, "Venmo me $25,000 in the next hour," or "I'm putting this picture all over social media." And I have some advice for parents, which is to never threaten to take your kids' phones away, because the most dangerous situation that a child or anyone could be in at that moment is when they're being sextorted and they're afraid to talk to their parent, or they're afraid to talk to a trusted adult because they're afraid of having their phone taken away. So the most important thing for parents to know is that parents have to tell their kids that even if they disregard everything they've discussed and break all the rules, when they get into trouble, they can still go to them for help.
And I actually have a follow-up question on that note as I come over from all of these spirit discussions with my students in the classes about how there's currently, I think, finally a reckoning with children's early exposure to technology, social media, and all of that. And another scholar who's also currently on tour from New York University, Dr. Jonathan Hai, has been pushing for this idea of age gating, right? Pushing kids off of smartphones until they reach high school age, not on social media until they're in middle school, like 16 and older, not even middle school. But on the flip side, there's definitely that tension with pushing kids off of things so that you're creating this, almost like mystery around exposure and potential anxiety or hiding or dodging parents' restrictive ways. So how do parents strike that balance between moderating their children's exposure and creating space for their social interactions?
Yeah, so I've interviewed so many parents for this book who tell me that they really think their kids are too young to be on social networks, but they're on social networks because all their friends are on social networks, right? And they don't want their kid to be the odd one out or deprived of important social connections. And so the advice that I give parents is to talk to the parents of their kids' friends while their kids are really young and collectively agree not to allow them to use social media until a particular age. I am with John here in that I think the magic number is 16. And I know that that sounds like age 40. I said this recently to a New York Times reporter, and she actually threatened to put my daughter's 16th birthday on her calendar and follow up with me to see if I could really do this. But there's really solid research out of the UK that shows that during the years when kids are going through puberty, which is younger for girls, using social media more is associated with lower life satisfaction a year later. And so the data is actually quite clear that during these very vulnerable windows, it's not a great idea for kids to be on social networks. I will share a very unpopular opinion right now, which is that I think Ron DeSantis is right about one thing, which is this new law in Florida that doesn't allow kids to use social networks until they're older and then requires parental permission at ages 14 and 15. Because the thing is that parents recognize that their kids shouldn't be on social media, but it's the group effect, right? It's the fact that everyone else is, and so if no one else is, it kind of does solve the problem. But of course, we know that laws like this need to be paired with mental health services and services offline in person for LGBTQIA+ kids and for for any kid who needs them. And that's where this becomes very tricky.
So one of the things that struck me about this book was its inclusive nature and the range of your research. And you mentioned LGBTQ, but there's also all sorts of different classes that get covered, and also ethnicities, and also a kind of international feel. So I wonder if you can talk to the particular challenges for different groups of women and the kinds of things that different people around the world are facing on social media.
Yeah, so I mean, I very much intended for this book to be a hugely intersectional book. One of the big things I look at is that, things are harder for women than for men on social networks, but things are hardest for women of color. And so I tell the story of one woman, a dear friend of mine, who's from Ghana, who used online dating apps for years, and we know that Black women are the people on online dating apps who are the least swiped. I tell a story of a Black woman who's a running influencer, a lovely woman named Kelly Boyer. And she has applied 3 different times to work with one particular brand that works with many white influencers with very similar follower counts and types of content as Kelly. And they keep turning her down. And she thinks it's because she doesn't have the stereotypical body of an elite athlete. I obviously talk about how women of color and Muslim women are up against the mother load of hate and abuse on social networks, things like rape and death threats all the time. I look at the experiences of non-binary and trans people, so just in particular, just the massive hate and violence that they're up against. And so while I think an important part of our conversation about social networks is the recognizing that many trans kids find healthier communities online, I think we also have to recognize that they are up against shocking hate. I tell the story of one woman who's a comedian in Brooklyn, and she so fears her physical safety that she'll only record videos in her apartment with the windows shut and the doors closed so no one could get any cues to what's happening outside and where she lives. It's quite terrifying. And so, I don't think social media should be seen as the answer for a society that refuses to meet the needs of trans and other kids offline. But I just think it's so important to recognize how all of these different markers affect the ways that people are treated online.
And to switch gears a bit to the professional realm, one thing I think that's really an outstanding feature of this book is that each chapter really takes a deep dive into all of the data and evidence about why things and how things are wrong. But every chapter ends with very empowering and, to me, very actionable advice for action, for change. So specifically, you mentioned in the book that when women use social media to try to bolster their professional profiles, they often end up with fewer followers, reposts, and resulting opportunities than men in their respective fields. Why is this, and what can we do about it? And speaking from your personal perspective, how you have wrestled with this very challenge.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I actually wasn't aware of this research, which shows that, when women experts share their expertise on social media, they get fewer followers and reposts and resulting opportunities like speaking engagements, until I started researching this book. And, I've been speaking about this book across the country, and women often leave my book events telling me, I am terrified, like, you have left me so worried for myself, for my children. And I always say good, because you should be, but also, there are things we can do, and I very much want to have a message of hope here. And here's a pretty easy one, which is that if we all decided to start following more women on social media, we could solve this problem. And, obviously, the problem, stems from offline bias. And so when people picture an expert in their heads, they often picture a man. And if you ask someone to picture a doctor, they're often thinking of a white man. And so it's so important for us to recognize this disadvantage that women experts have and to follow them more. And I feel so strongly about this that I've actually created a list of feminists to follow and put it on my website, which is just my name. Feel free to follow whoever you want, but the point is, here's a place to start if you need one, with just an incredible list of diverse women doing amazing things in the world. But if we all started following more women and amplifying their posts when we see them and when we appreciate them, of course, it would solve the underlying problem, right? Because people would come to see women as experts more. And so this is a really easy thing for us all to do, and I'd encourage you, if you have like 3 or 4 minutes today, to follow 10 more women.
Thank you.
Great. So one of the things that you talk about in the book is influencers. And I think we all have this impression of influencers, that they're people who are making gobs and gobs of money and that they have these glamorous lives. And one of the things that I learned from your book is that that's not really the case, and often these women themselves are being victimized. So I wonder if you could talk to that a little.
Yeah, so, now influencing is the new version of the American dream. The majority of teens say that they want to be influencers, but the reality is very different from popular conceptions of what this entails. And so most influencers are women, and most of those women earn far, far below the federal poverty level. And I think that these influencers are largely women who 20 years ago would have been freelance writing for magazines or newspapers, because there are so many women who are looking for flexible ways to make money while their kids are in school, because of the structure of our society that makes it so incredibly difficult to balance our caregiving responsibilities with our work. And so a lot of women are looking for flexible jobs, would have been writing for the traditional media, but now the money that advertisers used to send to newspapers and magazines, we all know, is going to Facebook and Google. And so traditional media outlets can't afford to pay women what they used to in the past. So a lot of women are now trying to become influencers. And I interviewed them. And the thing about this kind of work is that you have to project a perfect life. And as I write in the book, no one wants to buy products so that they can look like harried women with messy homes and misbehaved kids, right? That's not the life that anyone wants. And so if you want to make money from brands for your posts, your life has to be perfect, your relationships have to be perfect, your children have to be perfect. And so these women are under extraordinary pressure to project lives that they don't actually lead, because no one leads that kind of a life. I compare their work to the work that's done in an advertising agency. So in an advertising agency, which we know these agencies are largely run by men, especially at the top, you'd have a whole team of people doing the work that one influencer does on her own. So coming up with a story idea, getting props, getting music rights, shooting, editing, responding to followers, etc. And now you have one woman trying to do all this work and getting paid very little by brands. And so the pay gap between men and women who influence is actually far larger than the overall pay gap in the United States. And of course, on the flip side of this, one of the things I found to be very interesting is I have had a ton of therapists in my audiences. And I've also spoken to a lot of podcasters who've interviewed me about this book, and they tend to be therapists who have these podcasts going on these topics. And they keep telling me that their clients come to them, of course, upset that they can't live the lives that they see influencers posting. And guess what? Influencers are feeling the same way. So it's a really sad system.
Yeah, and speaking of the gap, as we survey all of these audience, half of our students and, colleagues are men, right? Male-identifying members of our society. And speaking as a fellow parent of a boy, I often wonder Of course, this book is specifically thematized around the toxicity around the treatment of women and girls. But what is your advice for men, boys, future men, and parents of boys?
So I've been really surprised at my bookstore events and just other events around the country. I've had such a large audience of men and boys, which I have really appreciated. Obviously, things like sextortion and abuse and difficulties with dating online apply to people of all genders. The reason that I frame this book around women and girls is because it's harder for women and girls, but it's also the case that people of all genders are obviously part of the solution. But I do think that there is a challenge here. So one of the stories I tell in the book is of the Gillette, The Best a Man Can Be video. Do you guys remember that video? It came out at the height of the Me Too movement in 2019. And the executive producer was actually a Hofstra alum, which is how I connected with him. And so this video, if you can't recall it, called on boys and men not to assault people and not to allow people to be assaulted in their presence. And I didn't find this to be a particularly offensive idea. In fact, there was no message that suggested that men should share opportunities with women or anything that I perceived to be threatening in any way. So I interviewed Rondell Westcott, this Hofstra alum, and he showed me videos of people who responded to this video by taking aluminum bats and hitting their cans of shaving cream and pledging to never purchase Gillette products ever again until everyone involved in the ad from top to bottom had been fired. This became the most disliked ad of all time on YouTube. And what Rondell explained to me is that in our culture, you can't tell boys and men what to do. And so as women, we're used to seeing these ads from Dove and other brands, which are arguably the predominant way that feminism is discussed on social media. And these ads are always telling us how to improve ourselves and be better. And if we just feel beautiful, act confident, and buy the right shampoo, we're gonna solve all our problems. And Rondell has said to me, you can't tell men to improve or change in our culture. And actually, after this video, he's not seen any brand ever attempt to do that again. This was a huge lesson in the advertising industry. And so I would just say that men and boys are part of the solution, but getting into that conversation, I think, is far more challenging than people often appreciate.
Thank you. So you speak of a form of sexism that when I was back in college, I imagined wouldn't be the case in 2024 and seems to have gotten increasingly virulent over that time. And I just wonder if by taking back the net, do you think that this can act as a tool, not just to mitigate the recent damages that have been done by social media, but to fundamentally change core beliefs in ways that I thought they would have already changed?
Believe it or not, I still do. So on the day the book was published, I wrote an op-ed for the Los Angeles Times about it. And my editor sent it back to me and said, no, you need to address this very question, which is, you say that social media is so toxic for women and girls, why should we be using it at all? And it's a really great, important question. And I do think that social networks are places where we can empower ourselves in all the obvious ways, like connecting with people in our fields and finding jobs and advocating for issues we care about. But it's also a place where we can learn. How many of you have seen the recent TikToks on microfeminism? Anyone? Okay, I see them all the time, but they've got me pegged. So this is a video that's a genre that has been trending on TikTok just very recently in the past few days. And it's this idea that you take very small actions in the offline world that upend traditional ways that things are gendered in our society. And so it's women like taking up more physical space on the subway, or it's, asking a more junior woman what she thinks before, a man speaks up in a meeting. And I have to say, I think about these issues all the time, and I have totally been learning from these TikToks. Just 2 days ago, someone who I very badly want to work with sent me an email, and she was trying to show me that she was getting through my book. And so she said, I read in your book that your husband is the cook in your family, and my husband's the cook in my family too. And so I wrote her back, and I said, phenomenal. We should swap recipes for our husbands to make us, and that'll be a fabulous act of microfeminism, which I learned about on TikTok. So I just have to say, there are so many ways we can learn, and these are also just incredible tools for raising awareness of issues and talking about issues that affect our lives. And so just a big thing that I talk about in this book is I call on all of us to rethink how we spend our time on social networks, what we watch, what we like, what we engage with, what we share, because I do think that we can do very, very powerful things with these tools.
Absolutely. And I think of microfeminism as one way in which we could approach this otherwise really grand, therefore unachievable goal of feminism on a more like mundane but civic level. But on the flip side, as you previously wrote about subjects like the Silicon bro, culture, tech bro culture, Bitcoin, AI, all of the new frontiers of technology where the kind of idea of male-dominated, especially masculinity, toxic masculinity, is very much built into the structure, the corporate ownership, the code even, the otherwise objective algorithm. These are bigger questions to tackle, but I wonder if you've thought about the legislative approach versus the corporate approach versus the everyday user approach.
Yeah, so, I've been writing about these issues for CNN since 2016, and Congress has done pretty much nothing about everything that I've been advocating for and talking about all this time. I do think that we are at a critical moment today where it is not too late for Congress to effectively regulate AI. And one of the things that I'm most concerned about are deep fakes. So you guys know what deep fakes are, right? Fake images that are generated by artificial intelligence, and the tools for creating them are now widely available across the internet, either for free or very cheaply. And does anyone want to guess the vast majority of deep fakes are?
Women.
Pornographic. So this happened recently in a town very near my home in Westfield, New Jersey, where the boys in the high school created new deep fakes of their female classmates. And the thing that I really couldn't get past in the Wall Street Journal's reporting of this issue was that parents in the town of Westfield were divided over whether this was a big deal. Now, one of the things that I write about in my book is that when a woman's nude images end up on the internet, it puts her at greater risk of sexual assault, it puts her at greater risk of depression, it puts her at greater risk of suicide, it makes it harder for her to get a job, it makes it harder for her to date. It is life-destroying. And so clearly we need a huge education in this country, not just among kids, but also adults about what people are really doing so that they can never use the excuse, I was just having fun. And now it's children who are up against this. So just, 3 weeks ago, it was 12-year-olds at a middle school in Beverly Hills who had these deep fakes created of them. And so this is something I feel very, very strongly about. I think, again, sorry to be professorial, but as a communication professor, I know that the way we name an issue, the way we talk about it, has such a huge effect on the solutions that are prescribed, on how our society deals with an issue. And I wrote a big piece for CNN Opinion just the other day arguing that new deepfakes are a grotesque form of violence against women and girls. Our society needs to recognize it as such. I'm actually now serving as an expert witness on this. in a case that you'll be hearing more about soon, I hope. But I think that this is a moment where it's so important for all of us to be involved in just saying that our society won't tolerate this kind of abuse.
And we started the semester with Taylor Swift, out of all superpowers, being personally victimized by that act.
Yeah, so women in the public eye, but it's not just them. And so I guess to answer your question about legislative solutions, the Defiance Act, which is currently before Congress, would allow victims to sue their perpetrators. Highly imperfect, because often it's very difficult to figure out who the perpetrators are. But I think that this would be a great deterrent and a great place to start. We know that President Biden has secured voluntary commitments, for what that's worth, from the heads of big tech companies to watermark AI. Or content generated by AI, but what we need right now, like tomorrow, is legislation that requires that content generated by AI be watermarked, and then also prohibits the removal of those watermarks, which is very, very easy.
So I, in the course of reading this book, felt increasingly terrified, and my natural response to it was, let's all get offline. And I just wanted to ask you about why that is not your solution. And along with that question comes the thing that you reiterate over and over in the book, which is that somehow the online world has reconstructed the world that we live in, whether that's dating apps that have us dating in different ways, even if we're offline, or the world in general, or the way we interact with one another, how we look at each other, how we feel, how deeply we can feel about the important issues that face us every day. So I wonder if you can talk to getting offline as a solution, and why it's maybe not the only answer, but also how the world has been reconstructed by this social media presence.
Yeah, so, I've been trying to listen to the people in my audiences, and obviously I believe that, closing our apps, shuttering our apps is not the solution here, and part of the reason for that is because it wouldn't solve the problem I'm telling you about, right? So even if the three of us stopped using social media, misogynists would still be sharing content that is making the world less safe for women and girls. And so the only solution is, of course, to fix what's wrong with social media. I've talked about how I think we can empower ourselves. I will say that I've been hearing from many women in my audiences who say to me, you say that, I shuttered Instagram 6 months ago and my life has never been better. And I say to them, the power to you, and when you're looking for your next job, you might go back on LinkedIn, right? So we all have to do what works for us individually, but I think the better solution is to change what we do when we witness abuse online, sexism, misogyny, violence, etc. And I think there's 3 big things we should do. First is not engage with this content, because it is very tempting, at least for me, to clap back and respond when I see these posts. But that, of course, boosts the post's engagement, which sends a signal to social networks that people like it and want to see more of it. The second is positive slamming. So if you see a woman, or obviously someone of any gender, being attacked, that person probably doesn't want their abuse given a higher profile with you posting about it. Instead, post something positive about the person, promote something they've done in their career. And then finally, I think we should report the abuse to social networks. And so, social media companies are famous for putting out these community standards, saying that they don't allow violence and misogyny, and then not taking content down that violates their own terms of service. And when women file reports, which you can do on most mainstream apps, saying this post violates your terms of service, these companies are infamous for either not responding to those reports or for writing the user back and saying, no, that rape threat you received did not violate our terms of service. So I think it is important for us to file these reports when we see abusive content, and I acknowledge that these companies are not good on acting on these reports, but I think if we all started doing this in mass, it would send a very powerful message to social networks that we are demanding that they remove this content from their platforms. And then getting to your question about, how what's happening on social media is changing the offline world. So I used to use the term IRL, in real life. I've stopped using that term. I edit it out when my editors try to put it in my work, because I think it's come to be not just antiquated, but very dangerous. It suggests that what's happening on social media is not profoundly impacting the offline world, when of course it is. And since you mentioned dating apps, that's a prime example. And so I think that dating apps have caused just a huge devolution in dating culture in the United States and in the ways that people treat one another. There's this conception that dating apps make it easy to connect with people. And I do want to acknowledge that for people who are minorities in their physical community, that widening of the pool can be very important. So members of the LGBTQ community are actually much more likely to find their partners online, and that's important. But the problem is that dating apps give this perception that there's always someone more to swipe on. And research tells us that when people perceive they have loads of options, they treat their partners more terribly, and they are more likely to break up with them. And just the thing I heard over and over from the women I interviewed for my book about their online dating experiences was that many of them had stopped using these apps altogether because they were so sick of being treated terribly by the people they met on them. And so, in 2020 and 2021, the marriage rate in the United States hit the lowest numbers since the federal government began tracking it in 1867. And that is a trend that was underway well before the pandemic. So people think, now with online dating, it's so easy, and it's just really quite the opposite, and it's very sad.
I wanted to just quickly circle back to the advice you gave earlier about the collective action part, because so much of the time we tend to think of social media use as a very individualistic choice. Therefore, the experience can also be extremely isolating, even though in theory it can be hugely connective and empowering. So I really appreciate the advice that you've given in terms of what we can all do to support each other and lift each other up, which I don't tend to think of, right? Even as Dr. Kozol was asking about deleting your app, getting off social media, personally, I've gone that route. And sometimes I look back and think, it's unfair. Why do I have to leave the platform to, to achieve my personal mental health and peace? So thank you for that. But so much of the time we've been talking today about women and girls as the victim, whereas I think a lot of our students are extremely plugged into the momfluencers as the villain, especially with some of the recently very high-profile, much publicized cases. And the social media platforms have very much left it, right, on people's own terms. Speaking of the individualistic, isolating approach, I wonder where you're standing with regard to momfluencers, parents wittingly choose to share and overshare and put their own kids at harm, in harm's way.
Yeah, it's a great question. So first of all, on empowering ourselves and one another, we've got to follow more women. We've got to, rethink what we share, what we amplify, and we've got to change what we do when we witness sexism and misogyny. But the other part of empowering ourselves is recognizing the need for connection that we all have that may or may not be fostered by social media. And so I think it's easy to think I have 2,000 friends on this app, or I have 20,000 followers on Instagram, and therefore I have all these friends. In reality, we're living in a time of what Marisa Franco calls a friendship famine. So now in the United States, it's much more likely for people to be disconnected than to be connected to other people. And none of us needs 2,000 friends on Facebook or Instagram or any other app, but what all of us need is 2 people we can call at the end of a really bad day. And friendships, it turns out, are more important for our health than even diet and exercise. So I want to say I'm really grateful to be on the stage with 2 of my good friends. But I think it's important to think about when we're using social apps, how we can make them tools for connection. And it could even be something as simple as, rather than posting things seeking affirmation by loads of people, direct messaging a close friend, right? And really checking in on a more personal level about how they're doing. Then to get to the momfluencers. So I just want to say that, if you are, say, a stay-at-home mom in our society, it is very difficult to get validation. And so many of these moms are turning to social media and sharing advice on how to get their kid to sleep through the night, because that's the only form of affirmation our society offers them, which is incredibly sad. My advice to parents is not to post pictures of our kids publicly. And so I'll post in a closed group, like on Facebook with friends who I know offline and trust, and I'll post very selective updates. And the reason I do that is because I actually think it's good for my young children to have a community of people all over the world, to have distant cousins in Sicily who are following their lives and who care about them, and to be part of that kind of a community. But the momfluencer content gets very scary very fast, and some of it is that it's coming from people who don't have credentials to be sharing medical and scientific expertise. So there's, moms sharing recipes for homemade infant formula during the recent shortage. It's unfortunately the case that you can't make infant formula in your kitchen. It requires nutrients that can't be bought at the supermarket. But that's pretty dangerous content for other mothers. And then a whole nother genre of all of this is people who prey on mothers. And the chapter that actually sold my book to my publisher, the sample chapter I wrote on the train while commuting to my job at Hofstra, is called Misinformation for Mommies. And our society talks about all other kinds of fake news, but rarely this, which is how people prey on mothers, because everyone knows that a mother will do anything to help her child. And so a child receives a devastating medical diagnosis, and people swoop in on social media to sell her, essential oils that they claim are going to, cure this child at vast, vast cost, because they know that a desperate mom will try anything.
Right at the outset of your book, you said something about looking at the sort of whole history of the world, and that there were two major revolutions. And I would like you to repeat that, just to give a sense of how serious and fundamental the change to social media is.
Yeah, so I quote the head of the Kinsey Institute, and I think he's absolutely right about this, who says that two big things have changed the way humans live over the past, I forget how many millions of years. The first was the agricultural revolution, and the second was the arrival of the internet. And I do think it's worth thinking about the fact that we are living through seismic change, and the way that our society chooses to handle these apps is going to have a profound impact on our offline lives and the lives of future generations.
So you also asked, you also mentioned right here that we can do things of a feminist nature online. But one of the things that you also talk about in the book is that what we see online that looks like it's feminist isn't really empowering women. And I wonder if you can talk, how do we know the difference between truly empowering content and false signs of empowerment that are actually disempowering women?
One of the things I talk about in my last chapter is what I mentioned before, that so much of the content we share about so-called feminism is created by brands, right? So it's, again, the Dove ads that tell women to feel beautiful and that you're beautiful no matter what you look like, but those ads feature airbrushed women who are actually quite conventionally attractive. And, the thing I'd say, for starters, is that corporations are not the best sources of our message
or of the messages that we should be sharing about feminism. And so, if corporations want to solve this problem, they can pay men and women equally. They can make it easier to balance our work with our childcare responsibilities and other caregiving responsibilities by not requiring overwork. There are many things that they can be doing, but it makes me very uncomfortable to have brands owning this space because, corporations are, people who we need to be holding to account in order to solve women's problems and really the problems of people of all genders. And so, I think it's important for us to be posting more authentic content about issues that affect our lives and amplifying that content when we see it. One woman I love on X, Amy Deal, if you don't follow her, she is phenomenal at aggregating stories, often pieces written by me and other just incredible women, and sharing them, and she puts just like the two-second takeaway in her tweet. That's a beautiful example of what I'm talking about here. I call on all of us to beware of virtue signaling. So again, as a professor, I very much appreciate that the first step towards changing things in our society often is raising awareness. And so it is great to post about an issue that you care about, but it's not enough. And if you want to take just a small step forward after that, I think it's really important to tag companies and lawmakers and tell them what you want to do. In communication, we call it a call to action. One thing I know from teaching public relations for many years is that the vast majority of a company's stock price is determined by its reputation. And so if people start tagging a brand and saying this unrealistic model generated by AI is disgusting and is not a good model for women and girls, they will change that tomorrow. Brands are very easily spooked. And so that's a place to start, is really by calling on people to do things on these apps.
And I think we're inching close to opening up to our audience for questions. So if anybody wants to step forward, speak into the microphone, given that our exchange is being recorded. In the meantime, there's a hand in the back.
Yeah,
Do you mind stepping to the forward?
There's a mic right here.
It's a long walk.
It's like The Price is Right. You got to come on down.
Okay. Testing. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, so this conversation has been positioned a lot towards mothers, parents, and what we can do as individuals, which is great. We can find ways to use our own agency. And I think microfeminism is a very smart and clever approach. One critique of microfeminism or modern day feminism in general is that the burden falls on the individual. It's become a do-it-yourself kind of feminism. So in the book, do you address how we can look externally and hold institutions accountable? Because I'm thinking of the HBO documentary that just came out about Brandy Melville. And it's a teen girls clothing brand. And it's been sexist, the owner, and racist about who works there and shopped at their stores. And the brand is known for only offering one size. And they didn't really advertise too much, but they used Instagram and got girls working for them to take pictures for their Instagram. And they're still successful now, like especially in China. And they haven't changed one bit. They haven't issued an apology, and they're like a corporation that like hasn't been canceled, even though like the documentary just came out. There's been reports before, and they just turned off Instagram comments. You can look at their Instagram now. Their comments are just off, like waiting for it to blow over. So I know it's not just an individual responsibility or the parent's responsibility, but also the responsibility of government, law enforcement, corporations, millionaires, billionaires, and you mentioned advertisers already. So is there any more advice on how we can fight against these institutions that seem too big to fail? Because I guess I'm a bit cynical, like how is this conversation ever going to be acknowledged outside of academia and taken seriously in the boardrooms that like actually need to hear this conversation?
So first of all, that is an incredible question. Thank you. And I think that anytime we're talking about these issues, it's so important to ask the question you asked right now, which is why should women be responsible for solving all our own problems, right? And how can we change institutions.
Yeah.
And so the answer is yes. So every chapter of my book ends with a section called What We Can Do About It. And it is just full of demands for lawmakers and tech companies. And I'll tell you about, I guess, a few of my favorite ones or biggest priorities. I think it's really important for the FBI to have a huge increase in resources to investigate acts of violence against people of all genders that are happening online. And they need to be given a mandate to investigate these things, right? So many women are threatened online, and the result is that the perpetrator stays online because he has so-called free speech, and the victim flees social networks, and that is absolutely unacceptable. And so I have a nifty idea for how we can pay for this, and it is with a tax on social networks. I think that would very easily solve the problem. So that's one thing that I would like lawmakers to do tomorrow. I have loads of demands for tech companies, but two big ones would be, I think it's really important for them to deplatform abuse. If you recall back when Twitter originally deplatformed Donald Trump, who was famous for sharing sexism and misogyny on his platform, in the days following that decision, millions more people started using Twitter. And so it is the case that if a platform chooses to start deplatforming users who are abusive, people take note very quickly, and that will be a huge deterrent for other users. So that's a huge one. And then another thing that I'd really like tech companies to do is to have some sort of a symbol to signal to us when content has been manipulated. And so one of the reasons why I think so many girls and women in our society have eating disorders is because, they're looking at these pictures of women's bodies that aren't real on Instagram and somehow, thinking that they should look like that. And if we had this continuous reminder every time we see a picture that that picture is not of a real human, right? That it's been filtered, that it's been edited, I think that would start to solve the problem. So those are just a couple of the demands I make. There's loads more. I do think that social networks should be responsible for the content they choose to amplify. And I do think they should be responsible for taking down potentially deadly misinformation that goes viral, that hits a certain number of users. And that would be a start. So again, that would require legislation as well.
Can I follow up on this idea of collective action and just ask you if you can talk a little bit about social networks or social media and social movements that have been effective around the world, possibly, and how we might learn from them and keep that trend to use the internet as a place for social organizing.
So Me Too is the obvious one, right? And that's a movement that was very much born online. And I do think it caused people to think twice before attacking or sexually harassing women in many parts of our society. The flip side of this is that, every time there is progress, there is often backlash against feminist movements, right? So the path is not linear, but we have seen loads of hashtags raise awareness of particular issues, whether it's violence against trans people, whether it's the sexualization of Black girls. I think that if you want to learn on social media, there are opportunities to do so. And just another thing that I think has really permeated our society in large part thanks to the conversations we're having on social media is the idea of intersectionality, is the idea that you can't just address gender without taking account of a person's race and class and other identities. And that's something that, feminists have taught people on these social networks. And so there's so many examples of how public perceptions have changed. Obviously, Black Lives Matter took off online. So many examples of learning and changing social perceptions with the conversations that we have online.
Hi, thanks for coming back, Kara.
Hello, my friend.
So two questions. One is picking up on your comment on progress made. So some students in my class, my civic engagement class, read the Gail Collins book, When Everything Changed, about American women since 1960. And one of the themes of that book is that things are getting better. So one question is whether they are with respect to social media. And then the second question is much more minute and specific, which is, to what extent do you think the fact that Siri and Alexa are female voices and we order them around, and we don't say please, and Alexa, turn this on. Siri, get me, get me this information. To what extent do you think that matters? And I'll sit down for your answer so you can talk to everybody.
So I'm sorry to end on a pessimistic note. I think we're going backwards. I don't just think that women are not making progress. I do think we're going backwards right now. If you look at the huge increases in domestic violence in this country since 2015, if you look at the increase in the percentage of teen girls who say they're being raped, if you look at the overthrow of Roe versus Wade, and it took me a very, very long time to get this argument past CNN's Legal and Standards team, but I did. And so I just want to say that, our society has talked about many reasons why Roe versus Wade was overturned, and obviously a big part of that is a decades-long, very well-funded advocacy effort. But I think the piece that has not been considered is why Supreme Court justices were so certain that there was the political and social will in our country to accept the reversal of a right that women enjoyed for decades that potentially saves a woman's life. And I do think that one part of this is the way abuse towards women is being normalized in our society, because it's spilling over from what's happening on social media, right? So because it is common for American teenagers to joke about, it's sort of hard for me to say these things, but what a woman looks like after being violently abused, and that's a common joke. And, when we start to think about women in this way, it's easy to then deny women rights or walk up to a woman on the streets of New York City and punch her, which has been, happened at least 14 times recently, or any of the other trends that I'm talking about here. So I think we're going backwards, but we don't have to, right? This is a moment for women to say, we won't accept this anymore. I do think, Professor Labresco, that it is problematic that people learn, including my own very young children, to order Siri and Alexa around. I'm waiting for a response, but I guess Alexa's not here. But the other aspect of this is the way our society is, everything in our society is built around men. So, the iPhone was designed for the palm of a man's hand. It's too big for a woman's hand. Or the way the voice recognition system in my car never seems to understand me. Every morning I drop my kids at school, I call my mother. The voice recognition system cannot get this down to call mom. But if my husband says things, and often I'll ask my voice recognition system to do something and it won't understand me, and so my husband will repeat it for me because it understands a man's voice. And so, I think we need to think broadly about the gendered ways that all of these things are constructed. But yes, we live in a society that asks women to serve them. And that's a really great observation.
I can go?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, my name is Dorcas. So the question I have to ask is, what are some red flags or warning signs that parents should look out for in terms of their teenage daughter's social media use and mental health?
That's such a great question. I asked this question myself to a therapist who I interviewed for the book, and it's tricky because teens are very moody, right? So she talked about, changes in their mood, changes in their behavior, changes in the way they're eating. Some of this is normal for teenagers, but if lots of signs are present at once, that's a red flag. I think, one of the best things that parents can do is just keep in regular conversation with their kids. And so a lot of parents tell me they don't know how to create a TikTok. They're terrified of social media. Their parents never had this conversation with them. Like, this is just, like, they don't know how to deal with all of this. And one thing I'm often saying to parents is, you don't have to be on TikTok, but if you're generally consuming the media, if you're reading the New York Times, you know that what's trending on TikTok right now is Sephora Kids and Botox Babies content, telling 10-year-olds that they need full faces of makeup and telling 20-year-olds that they need Botox, which is a terrible idea if you're 20 years old. And so you can have that conversation with your kids, and part of it is being in dialogue with your kids, right? So one of my close friends came to one of my book events, and she's a big sister to a girl in her community, started talking about it, and the girl immediately started telling her a story of nude images that were being circulated in her school. And so I think it's a really great idea for not just parents, but like trusted adults, people who love kids in our communities, to keep up with, read the ProPublica report on how catfishing has become, a huge global business, and have that conversation with your kid about why you never accept a follow request if you don't know the person offline, and why you confirm that it's truly that person before you trust them. And in the course of like that dialogue, I think kids will share what's happening most of the time.
Thank you.
Thanks for the great question.
Hello, thank you for coming to talk with us today. Your book touches on a lot of topics that are personally interesting to me, and I hope that I can kind of build off of your research during my time here at Hofstra. So I've noticed throughout the past couple years, through just my own personal observation, that TikTok has kind of gotten better in terms of promoting more positivity and more feminism, whereas Instagram is kind of going the other way around. I've noticed like exponentially through the past couple months, Instagram has gotten a lot worse in terms of spreading racism, hatred, like just like the most vile stuff. And it's so much worse than I've ever noticed throughout the past couple years. And I was wondering if you had any insight as to why that's the case, but TikTok seems to be getting a little bit better about it.
So it's so interesting because all of us see such different things on social networks. And so unless I get a burner phone and start to follow your interests, I'm not going to see what you're seeing. And that's part of what prevents us from solving these problems. I will share my personal opinion with you, which is that TikTok is not to be trusted. And so it is the case that, many young girls have found a voice on social media and do not appreciate that old white men in Washington are trying to take it away from them. And it is also the case at the very same time that TikTok is a very dangerous platform. I can tell you, I worked in the Obama administration. The Chinese government stole my fingerprints. And so, if you look at, studies that have been done recently about the prevalence of content that makes the Chinese Communist Party unhappy on Instagram versus on TikTok, you will find much more of it on Instagram. And so TikTok is just not a great platform to be on, nor is Instagram. My biggest problem with Instagram is the visual focus, is the focus on people's faces and bodies. Whereas on TikTok, it can feel like you can be more playful and sort of share more of your life. But neither one is any good. And here's the solution. The solution is nonprofit social networks. And I have to say, I spoke about this book at the U.S. Department of Commerce to their staff last month. And, this is the agency of government in the United States that's arguably most receptive to the message from TikTok's PR team that so many small businesses find their audiences on TikTok, and that, shuttering TikTok in the United States would have a huge economic impact on our country. And I said at the Commerce Department, the solution is nonprofit social networks where all these small businesses in America can connect with their audiences. And no one challenged me on this. I'm really sad to see that there hasn't been an effort to do this, right? But I think that's the solution. You can imagine a nonprofit social network that doesn't algorithmically privilege misinformation and misogyny, which is what's happening on these social networks. Because basically, what these social networks are doing, and they may or may not be right, is they are showing you what they think will cause you to spend the most time on their platform, regardless of whether or not it's healthy for you or for our society. So a professor I really admire in London just a few weeks ago surveyed boys in the UK about the terms that they most frequently search on TikTok, and then she created accounts and searched those terms. Within 5 days, the amount of misogyny that TikTok was promoting to these boys, their fake accounts, right, quadrupled. And there have been so many studies that show, if a girl opens an account on Instagram or TikTok and searches for mental health content or body image content, she will soon be promoted suicide content and advertisements for tummy tuck surgery and weight loss drinks, right, if you pretend to be a 13-year-old girl. And so it's super dangerous. Nonprofit social networks are the way to go, and I don't know where they are.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. As you mentioned that we are the one who is choosing our reels and what we are watching. So my question is, why do you think that on Instagram, where a lot of trends emphasize authenticity and health, we still encounter criticisms to those who look good or work hard for their fitness, labeling them as unreal? Why aren't more people inspired by these individuals instead of dismissing their achievements?
So you're asking about the negativity that people come up against
Yes.
when they post online.
Yes, as you mentioned, that people who are bringing this lifestyle of happiness that I believe exists, and that what I want our society to shift in, and you label it as unreal, something that is unreal on Instagram, but why?
And you're saying it's being labeled as such by users, right, who are posting negative comments?
No, you said that having this perfect Instagram life is unreal. And that's where my question is coming from.
Got
why
it.
we want this more instead of like...
Right, so why shouldn't we want our lives to be great, right?
Better.
Yeah. And so I guess this comes down to a question philosophers have been debating for, centuries, which is like what a good life is, right? And I would say that, what is often promoted on social networks is a life that privileges people's, judging people for their appearances rather than for their other contributions to the world, and puts a lot of pressure on people to achieve things that are very difficult to achieve. So, to give you an example from my life, I'm a working mom. It is very, very difficult to take care of my children and do my job and also have a pristine home and kids who don't have stains on their clothes and, cook perfectly balanced meals 3 times a day and things like that. That isn't something that I am capable of doing, and most women aren't, right? Because our society sort of has such difficult standards. And so when I see that content, I am certainly not going to hate on the woman who posted it, right? Or make negative comments about her. Some people will. But my concern with that content is that it's making people feel less than. And it's been so interesting to me to hear from so many therapists who've interviewed me and come to my book events who say, this is one of the primary things they hear from their clients, right? So one therapist who was asking me a question the other day in my audience was telling me, my client, she wanted a picture of her baby, just like the pictures all these momfluencers post, and she hired the photographer and went to the beach, and it turns out her baby hates sand. And the whole event was a disaster. I can picture it in my head. And so, she left there feeling like she wasn't a good enough person. There must be something wrong with her, that she can't get this life that other people can achieve. And so I guess my concern is not eating healthy meals, right? And, doing what makes you happy. It's my concern is that what I repeatedly heard from the women and girls I interviewed is that they see these pictures online and can't achieve these lives, and they think something is wrong with them. Does that make sense? And then I'm also, of course, worried about unrealistic body standards that have people starving themselves and doing other dangerous things.
A quick follow-up
Yeah,
question?
of course.
Have you ever interviewed somebody who had a positive experience and Instagram motivated them to work harder?
So I don't know that I asked the question as such in my interviews, but I interviewed tons of women who've empowered themselves on social networks. So one scientist who I interviewed has connected with other women in her field all over the world, and one of the things she does is she writes Wikipedia bios of women scientists because there aren't enough, right? And that's the way she empowers other women. So I interviewed tons of women who found ways to empower themselves on social networks, to advocate for issues, to get the jobs they wanted. And a big part of my message, and I think where I'm different from some other people who are selling books in this space right now, is that I say that so much of it depends on how we use social networks, right? So social networks are places where people like Vivian develop eating disorders, and they're places where other people find their people and develop interests that turn into careers and get involved in important causes. And both things are true at the same time, that so much depends on how we use it.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
You kept mentioning during your presentation today as a professor, and things of that nature. And then you said professorial, which is a great word, by the way. Love
Thank
that word
you.
now. But I want to ask you about, because you were saying as a professor and then different ages with social media, how do you take the research and books like this and these conversations and bring it back to open up a dialogue in the classroom about topics like social media and communication, things of that nature, with your students who are my age, who grew up with these platforms and have grown to love them?
Well, let me tell you, I learn a lot from my conversations with my students. So one of the things that shocks me the most is the fact that my students don't receive educations on this topic until they come to my classroom. So if my kids were growing up in Finland right now, they would be learning how content affects their emotions and how to identify content that's been manipulated at the same time that they were learning how to read and write in elementary school. And I don't know what your experience has been, but I teach social media now, and no student who's ever taken one of my social media classes has received an education in disinformation and the dangers they're going to face online before they walk in the door of my classroom. So I'm always learning from my students about the trends that they're seeing on social media, which given my demographic is different from what's in my feed. And I'm always learning about what has them upset and what they're watching. And my students will talk to me about meeting up with people they met on Tinder, right? And I'm constantly telling them that's really dangerous. And so I think it's a matter of, again, trying to listen, right? And listen to the experiences that they're having, and then talk about how the research applies. Does that sort of get at your question?
Sense. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
So there are many influencers and content creators online who become victims of doxing that result in more dangerous stalkers or cases of swatting. Myself included, every AFAB content creator I've ever interacted with and met have had a story of a stalker or an instance of being doxed, like a phone number or address being leaked. Many police departments are no help when it comes to violent stalking and threats online. One example, Maya Higa, who is a Twitch streamer and entrepreneur, who was told that she couldn't be helped with a violent stalker unless they came to her property and until she just told them to stop, and they didn't. And that was even though her stalker had often found her address even after moving around multiple times, and has made threats that he would show up, harm her family, and in some cases tried to. So what advice do you have for influencers or content creators whose safety is compromised through doxing about keeping themselves safe? And what do you think can be done to prevent things like doxing and stalkers online that bodies of authority don't take seriously?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. If you're not familiar with the terms, doxing is when you share someone's personal information, like their home address online, and that can enable swatting, right? So then someone calls the police and pretends to be you and says, I'm being held up at gunpoint in my home, and the police arrive and could actually kill, the people living in that home. So it's really scary. I think we have to take these threats seriously. I, as someone who writes in this space, have, paid a few $100s to have my address and my husband's home address, scrubbed from the internet, which is a really good place to start. And I think very, very carefully about what I post publicly and what I share publicly. Police are absolutely awful. I remember I was receiving death threats a few years ago and reported it to the police. And I had the guy's name. He used his real name. The police said, "Thank you, this is really helpful, because then if anything happens to you, we'll know, who it was." No, that's what I was told by an NYPD officer, and every woman in this space has a similar story. So I think the answer is actually not with local police, it's at the federal level. We know local police officers are not trained to investigate online crimes, and they don't take them seriously. And I'm sorry you've had these experiences as well. So that's where we need better federal laws in certain instances. Like, to give you one example, 48 states have criminalized what we call revenge porn, which I think is a totally inappropriate term, but this idea of sharing people's intimate images without their consent. But the problem is that when it happens to a woman, pretty much no one investigates most of the time, and part of it is that it's really hard to identify perpetrators, and often these things happen across state lines, so no one wants to get involved. So that's where, as I said before, we need a massive increase in FBI resources and a mandate for them to investigate these things. But first, the thing that we need is a federal law that criminalizes sharing a woman's images without her consent, and that would be the SHIELD Act would be an example of a bill before Congress right now that Congress is also not acting on. And so I think the target has to be the federal level, because that's where we'd get more resources for this. My solution is a tax, which who cares if social networks don't like it? They have loads and loads of profits, and it would actually be really easy. What's missing in this country is the political will to protect women and girls. It's not anything else. It's the political will to pass these laws to tax social networks. It's not a matter of money or anything else. And in the meantime, I think we have to be careful about protecting ourselves, careful about what you post and what you reveal about yourself, unfortunately, online as well.
Thank you.
So, hi. So I had a question. So about dating apps in particular, we see that obviously they don't really engage in like long-term relationships, and I was wondering like how this would affect like marriage. Obviously, like marriage, the rates of divorce have been going up and the rates of marriage have been going down. Like, hypothetically, is it the smartest idea for women in general to want to get married? Because like in history, it's always been like arranged marriages. It's never considered women in that aspect. Like, is it smart to want to pursue that as like a woman and like wanting to start a family? Like, there's obviously legal actions that can be done with marriage, and I was just wondering what's your like opinion on that?
Sure. How much time do you have? So there's a book, I think a bestseller now, Liz Len's book is called This American Ex-Wife, and it makes the case that women should not get married. She's never been happier since she got divorced. I will say that, obviously this is a personal choice for everyone. There is a very large literature that shows that people who are married are happier in life. But obviously that very much depends on who you're married to, right? Finding the right person. I think part of the solution here is changing the way our society views dating and people who are single. So a big part of the problem is that, our society's idea of a single woman, picture her, she's needy, she's emotionally vulnerable, she's desperate to be in a relationship. All of that is actually very inaccurate. So according to Pew surveys, far more single men are looking for relationships right now than single women in our country. But I think a big part of the reason why dating is so hard is because for women in particular, they're made to feel that they can't say that they're looking for a relationship, and it's supposed to be like in the movies where then he realizes he's been looking for a relationship all the time, right? Once he meets you, and that doesn't work at all. And so I will say, if you want some advice on online dating, one of the people I interviewed for my book is one of my close college friends who was using online dating, very unhappy with her experiences, and she'd gone to work for one of the world's most elite consulting firms after school. And one day she said, I am going to apply the same degree of savvy to my dating life that I use in my career. And so what she did is she put on her profile, I'm looking for a relationship, and if you're not, please don't message me. And the other thing that you have to do is you have to filter through profiles very aggressively. So dating apps claim if you answer all of these very intimate questions, they're going to match you with someone who's compatible with you. That is not possible. So decades of research tell us that it is not possible to predict whether two people will be compatible by looking at their qualities. So it's on you to say if you're looking for a relationship, to say that, and then to filter through profiles and look for people who seem to be what you're looking for and who seem to have put some effort into their profile if what you want is a relationship. And I will say my friend Kate, who did this, went on a series of dates with 7 men after putting this on her profile. And not all of them were people she was compatible with or she was interested in. But the point was that once she started doing that, the dates themselves gave her hope that there were still good people out there who treated other people well. And number 7 was named Ryan. She married him last summer. I hope that helps.
So we are actually out of time, but we do have a couple more questions. So why don't you continue? People can leave, and anyone who wants to stay and hear the last questions? Okay.
I'll talk fast, I promise.
Okay. And maybe we can even sort of head out together and you can ask one-on-one since there is another event here. Thank you all so much for coming, and let's give Cara Limo a hand. And everybody read the book. As you can see, it's really, really important.